Hi, everyone. I'm Toby Wagner, a student at Moody Bible Institute. For the next few minutes, I'd like to speak with you about the importance of the 12 historical books in the Bible and how you and I can better interpret them for our personal study or to use in our local church or ministry setting. First, there are 12 books of the Bible that are classified as historical. I choose to call them historical accounts. They are sometimes divided into two groups, writings and the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are all in the former prophet category according to the Lexham Bible Dictionary, whereas 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, and one of my favorites, Esther, all belong in the writings category. Now, looking at all of them, we can immediately see that these books are found in the Old Testament. If your church is like mine, the Old Testament doesn't get a lot of the same attention that the New Testament does, even more so when it comes to historical books specifically. Perhaps it's because interpretation can take time to ensure it remains in context. In addition to the Lexham Bible Dictionary I mentioned, I'm going to use a couple of other great resources for this presentation. If you don't have these in your personal library, I would suggest that you consider them for your collection and your study. The first book is by Robert Chisholm. It's called Interpreting the Historical Books, an Exegetical Handbook. Another is The Art of Biblical History by B. Phillips Long. And lastly, I'm going to reference the Old Testament Historical Books and Modern Scholarship book by J. Gordon McConville. Having multiple resources to cross-reference will only make one studying of the historical books better because we're aiming to keep the message, their historical account, into context. McConville points out that reading the history books can be done as literary works. How do we do this? Well, he suggests that we consider these historical books as works of literature regardless of the history of the text. He also says that we should read the books as separate and individual in character. How do we do that? McConville asserts in his view that the modern debate revolves around definition of the extent of literature, relation to the text, to tradition, the literary relationship between parts and the whole, the diversity of ideas, and then kingship and worship. Robert Chisholm explains the historical books this way. He said these books all have settings, characterization, and plots. They include discourse and dramatic structures. He asserts that we prepare for interpretation by looking at the Bible chronologically as to when did this occur. We can ask questions like, when did this event occur? Was it during the time of the conquest, the judges, or united monarchy? Was it during the divided monarchy? Was it in Judah or during the exile or return? Once we establish that fact, we begin to look for semantics and syntax in understanding what this text is saying to us. This means having the right tools. Chisholm says on page 150 of his books that dictionaries, lexicon, word books, concordances, they're all helpful and almost essential. We have to keep in mind that as part of this interpretation, there is what's called polysemism, or knowing what the word actually means in the Old Testament. Knowing that each word can have more than one meaning and knowing which meaning applies to that which we're reading matters. He goes on to say that having handbooks or Bibles books like I'm using for this video is crucial. We also have to have resources for biblical narrative that looks at the literary technique that I mentioned earlier. Of course, commentaries for cross-referencing are important, especially at least one or two sources that deal with background or culture at the time of the writing. For me personally, I like the IVP background commentary. In the historical books, Chisholm helps us to see that there are some basic elements in about every story. We can see that reading in his book on page 26. The setting has physical, temporal, and culture included. Where the story unfolds is important, but those added features around that event matter just as much and sometimes even more so. Looking at the characters or characterizations that are going on also can make a difference. Chisholm calls it the necessary ingredient of any story. What is the story about? What is the plot? What events are included in the plot? Is one person being elevated above the other? Is good winning over evil? One example he gives is the story of David and Goliath, where there's truly a hero and a villain. Guess what? The hero wins. It's not always this simple in the history books, though. Chisholm tells us that the plot structure can vary depending on the story's length, complexity, and plot type. There can be punishment and rewards in these narratives, or they can be used as initiatory, sequential, consequential, introductory, flashback, etc., etc. These can occur in each discourse or dramatic fashion. A couple more things I wanted to share. When we study the Bible, the main or dominant theological theme that Chisholm says occurs in these books is the faithfulness of God. We can see that on page 89. We see this again and again because God's faithfulness is in his presence with his people. We see the power of God on display continually. The history books not only demonstrates God's love for his people, but serves as a challenge to Israel to remain faithful to the Lord, knowing that obedience brings blessings and disobedience brings discipline and undermines what Chisholm says is the Lord's covenant with his people. I'd like to close with these thoughts on how we can apply what we're reading, apply it to our lives to better understand what we've read. There was an article on Ethnos 360 online. It's the Ethnos 360 Bible Institute. It says that there's some questions that you and I can ask that will help us as we read. 1, who's the author of the passage and what is known about him? 2, who is the audience and what circumstance did they find themselves in? 3, at what point in history were these people living? 4, what was going on politically, economically, culturally, and religiously at this time? When we ask these questions, we ultimately keep the greatest question of all close to our heart. Where is God? What is he doing? Is he silent, active, passive, or aggressive in the story? And when we do that, we can take home these 6 important facts. By reflecting on the story, what was the issue and how did God respond? 2, learning about the nature of God and who he is, how he fights for us, how he longs for us to do the right thing, to make the right choice, how God responds to sin and disobedience, and how he responds with obedience. We learn that there are consequences and rewards for our actions. We learn that God is holy and he's just. We learn that vengeance is his, and when he's on our side, we always win in the end. And most of all, we should see that God longs for a relationship with us. And whatever struggle or trial or tribulation that we may find ourselves in, we know that God is always present. You see, as Long puts it, the Bible is not a science book, a law book, an ethics book, or a book of theology, a book of politics. It's not even a history book, but rather the Bible is scripture that is God-breathed. And if I could say it this way, full of information that leads you and I into a deeper relationship with God, where we understand who he is, and by knowing him, we live better because we want to please him out of a desire to have fellowship with him, which ultimately leads others to him. Therefore, there are lessons about God in every book of the Bible. This includes the historical books in the Bible. Knowing the historical account of the author is much more important than just the events or the point of time itself, because we know that God is unveiling himself to us to be known, not only today, but to see him throughout all of history, the way he has loved us as his creation from the beginning. Thanks for taking time to join me for this lesson and for this assignment in Studies of the Old Testament Historical Books, Class BI-6625. I'm Toby Wagner.